But what I've seen in the last 3 years has altered my thinking. And so I'm very, very concerned that we're going to see some kind of military action here. It's possibly as late as this year. My personal opinion is that Xi will not take any military action before the November 5th election.
Office. And clearly there was a debate in the Biden administration about what its approach to China should be. It seems to have settled on they're going to take some measure on the technological side, right, where they're going to protect a small number of technologies rigorously. In every other respect, it seems to be that engagement is back in full force.
And the Chinese Navy 25 years ago was very small, old, 1960s era ships that didn't operate much more than 20, 30 miles from their coast. Fast forward to today, it's the Chinese Navy now that has over a 100 ship advantage in major combatants. They are the dominant naval force in the Western Pacific, that the Chinese are now the largest navy in the world. And it's not just the numbers of ships that they have, but it's the quality of their ships. The anti-ship cruise missiles that are 200 to 300 kilometers in range and supersonic in flight, where the U.S. Navy doesn't have that yet fully across our fleet.
That we need to recognize Taiwan, because recognizing Taiwan is recognizing the strategic realities of the 21st century, the reality of today, right now, not the legacy of the past.
Welcome to the show. In this interview, we delve into the strategies of Deng Xiaoping, the mastermind behind China's threat deflation. Prepare to uncover the subtle spread of China's influence over decades and the catastrophic mishaps of the Obama administration. From the Scarborough Shoal incident's impact on regional stability to the alarming violations by the CCP. Does the current administration have a strategy in dealing with China's growing aggression? Should U.S. nukes find their way to Taiwan? Can we anticipate a reckoning over Taiwan's sovereignty? Welcome to the show.
Hi everyone, welcome to the show. Today we have two guests. It's Bradley A. Thayer, who is a founding member of the Committee on Present Danger China and former visiting fellow at the Magdalen College, University of Oxford, and Captain James Fanell, who is also a founding member of the Committee on Present Danger China and also a former US Navy captain serving 29 years in the military. And he was a former director of intelligence and information operation for the US Pacific Fleet. Gentlemen, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you. It's our pleasure to join you today.
Good to be with you, Richard, again.
Thank you very much. I would like to say it's so amazing for me because, Jim, this was our first interview when I started my channel. So this is kind of special for me. Good. Today we would like to talk about your new book, Embracing Communist China. And I would like you to tell me a little bit about, there is a topic, a motive that you discuss through the whole book is the threat deflation. And this describes how the PRC masterfully played the West. Which one of you would like to begin? Because that's a very interesting motive in this book.
Well, thank you, Richard. That's a concept that Jim and I have developed, which explains a very rare event in international politics where one state underestimates year after year the threat posed by another. So with the People's Republic of China's rapid growth, this is quite an anomaly in international politics in two respects. First, that China grew so quickly, which is quite rare. Japan did it after 1868 and Germany did it under Bismarck, where China was about 0.6% of world gross domestic product in 1990, but in 2019, it's about 19% of world gross domestic product. So that's a spectacular rise. But a second element, which is quite unique, is that the US didn't do anything about it. The logic of international politics is balancing, that if one great power is rising, states should balance against it in international politics. But that didn't happen. And it didn't happen because we argue of threat deflation, where the US intelligence community, the US military, year after year, consistently underestimated the threat. And it did so in large measure because of China's influence, the PRC's influence in American politics with American universities, think tanks, philanthropic foundations, universities, media. And that was a product of Deng Xiaoping's strategy of hide and bide, right, which he enacted in the wake of Tiananmen and efforts by the Bush administration, first Bush administration, to pressure him. And so he expertly and with great genius adopted that strategy to minimize the threat and make Wall Street and U.S. investors, U.S. Chamber of Commerce, businesses, and in time politicians, universities, media, his partner. So there was a partnership between the CCP and much of the American elite. So year after year, that contributed to threat deflation and explains that anomaly of why the United States did nothing to stop the rise of its existential enemy.
Yes, maybe, Jim, maybe the military angle, or would you like to expand on that?
No, Brad has laid out the thesis for the book. The full title is "Embracing Communist China: America's Greatest Strategic Failure." So we focus in on the fact that the institutions in our government that were designed specifically in the post World War II era in the 1947 National Security Act were designed to ensure that the United States was never again surprised like we were on 7 December 1941, or even as late as 9/11 with the attacks in New York and the Pentagon. So these institutions, the presidency, the Congress, the intelligence community, the Department of Defense, they failed. They failed to see this threat. And there's reasons for it, as Brad has suggested, that Deng's strategy was very good, and it played to our vulnerabilities, which are inherent in a capitalist system which seeks to make money and expand their business and become richer. So Deng understood that that was a vulnerability, and he played to it. But it also gave rise to another group called the Engagers. So it wasn't just in Wall Street, which was a big part of it, and paid for the military that was modernized over the last quarter of a century. But the engagement community, the people inside the government, inside the State Department, inside the E-ring, if you will, of the Pentagon, the people that were at our leading think tanks and research centers, all had this philosophy of we must engage with the Chinese Communist Party. They never said Chinese Communist Party. They always said we must engage with China. But in effect, they were engaging with the Chinese Communist Party because they said if we talk with them and work with them, things will they'll understand why our system is better, and they'll come around to adopting the standards and the norms of the international order that were created in the post World War II era. But we should have not been so naive to think that. Maybe it made sense in 1971 to 1979 as we're thinking about, and Kissinger and Nixon are thinking about how do we combat the threat from the Soviet Union. But by 1989 and what they did at Tiananmen Square should have taught us, or not taught us, but it should have alerted us to the fact that, hey, something's not right here. This is a malign government that are basically communist, Chinese communists, and they have a worldview that's opposed to freedom and liberty. And so we didn't do that, and that's why it was a failure. In terms of the military, it's very clear that what Brad described in terms of the Wall Street crowd, that funded, as I said, a quarter of a century of military modernization in just one arena that we talk about in the book is, for instance, in the naval arena. If you go back 25 years ago, the U.S. Navy, was 100 ships, major combatants, larger than the PLA Navy. We had a 100-ship advantage over them. And the Chinese Navy 25 years ago was very small, old, 1960s era ships that didn't operate much more than 20, 30 miles from their coast. Fast forward to today, it's the Chinese Navy now that has over a 100 ship advantage in major combatants. They are the dominant naval force in the Western Pacific. And they're obviously, we announced, the Department of Defense here announced 2 years ago or 3 years ago that the Chinese are now the largest Navy in the world. And it's not just the numbers of ships that they have, but it's the quality of their ships, the anti-ship cruise missiles that are 200 to 300 kilometers in range and supersonic in flight, where the U.S. Navy doesn't have that yet fully across our fleet. And it's the ability to send ballistic missiles, anti-ship ballistic missiles from shore that we saw them test in 2020 south of Hainan Island. Now we're watching that technology being used in the Red Sea by Houthi rebels. So where do you think the Houthis got that technology? Well, they got it from China, who's proliferating this to sow a worldwide disruptions against the United States and the international order that we've kind of been leading. And so it's really a dire situation that we find ourselves in. And our book makes some suggestions on how we can turn this around. But first, we have to acknowledge that we're in a dire situation. In our conversations this last couple of weeks with different podcasts and radio hosts, it's clear that not everybody understands it yet. And so that's our first order of business.
Yeah, I think you talk about the unconstrained and unaccountable engagement. I think you described the unconstrained. What about the accountability? As you said, it's been going on for decades and there's been probably some pushback. How could this keep going on for so many decades?
Well, that's a key question, indeed, right? That's the central issue here is how could this happen for so long? It needs to be explained, and that's why Jim and I came to this issue, which is what we're seeing is remarkable, and no one is saying anything about it. And it should not have happened. And it would not have happened, of course, under the principles of the Cold War or of the strategists at that time who had a power politics a framework, understanding of international politics. As Jim said, right, that fell away after the Cold War. And after the Cold War ended successfully with the demise of the Soviet Union, the engagement school then came to the fore, in part because of the end of history moment, right? It was also the fact, Richard, of that there was a euphoria when the Soviet Union fell, and the belief that great power politics was a thing of the past. And as Francis Fukuyama told us very famously in 1989 and then 1992 with his book, that it was liberal democracy and capitalism had triumphed and ideological struggles had fallen by the wayside. Now, that played exactly into Deng's strategy, right? That he was obviously tangentially a major supporter of what Fukuyama was arguing, because Deng's hide and bide was predicated on the idea that America had this euphoric moment. It, it fed America's ego and perception of itself, if you will, its self-love and the hubris that came after that, that we would never again face a great power competitor. So the elements of what Deng did, as well as the end of history moment, all had a key role to play in this. But much more significantly, it was that failure of the U.S. national security community, Richard, not to take the lessons of the successful end of the Cold War victory and the creation of really a Pax Americana, a period of stability driven by American power, which should have lasted for many, many, many decades. But because those principles were forgotten, misplaced, ignored, dismissed, or outright rejected, you had the engagement school come to the fore. And as a result of that, you had this remarkable event occur, which was a peer competitor of the United States arose without the United States taking any action against it, which is a remarkable event in international politics. And much even more remarkable was that the US funded it, right? That US investment manufacturing was encouraged to go to China. US investment was encouraged to go to China. So this is just a remarkable time in international politics, which compelled us to write the book, to explain it, to explain these causes, to explain in some detail about why this occurred, why the US national security community failed, and then also to talk about solutions, measures that the US must take to address this grievous failure.
Dear viewers, help us overcome algorithm suppression by liking, commenting, and sharing this important content, especially since we talk to world's top experts.
One have actually almost to admire how the CCP played the West. I mean, it's kind of genius. Jim, what would you
That's
like to?
we call Deng. Deng was one of the greatest
Yeah,
strategists of the
yeah,
20th
yeah.
century,
It's
and he's
just
not recognized.
yeah,
He's not
incredible.
recognized as such, but he should be.
Jim, what would you like to add?
Well, I think, in the book we talk about, various aspects of the causes that Brad's described, but the impacts, and some of the impacts are generated by leadership, and so leadership in America counts, and so we kind of go through the various presidents that were, leading America through these years. Both Republican and Democrat are responsible for not reacting and not perceiving the threat and not preparing the nation to defend itself and to deter such a threat until the last administration. And this is seems to be one of the most controversial aspects of the book because of the polarized political situation in the States right now and in Europe, obviously. And so we're not. This book isn't written as a political, book for any one party, but we do acknowledge the fact that it wasn't until that Trump administration came in that there was actually a major fundamental shift from this engagement policy. And that's undeniable that we switched. And for whatever reasons, we can talk about those. But the fact of the matter is, the U.S. government, when Trump and his team came in, said, no, we need to question why we're engaging and what the return on investment is, and do all these promises of engagement, have they paid off? And they came to the conclusion very quickly that just this blind engagement, as Secretary Pompeo called it in 2020, had not brought forward the promises of a better and more stable Indo-Pacific region. In fact, engagement had brought us much worse stability and much more danger, much more threats, and much more. I mean, in terms of America, it actually brought us death. This engagement now has killed 70 to 100,000 Americans every year from fentanyl. Now, we can blame people for taking the drug themselves, but there is clear and unambiguous evidence today that the Chinese Communist Party is actively pushing this drug into our nation so that it will kill Americans, and it has. We have Chinese coming across our border,
Yes.
military age males, documented video footage showing combat age males with short haircuts that very much look like PLA types are coming into our nation. We have clearly where you're at in Taiwan, just in the center line of the Taiwan Strait from 1954 to 2020, the PLA Air Force only crossed that center line 4 times with aircraft. And now because you live there, that you're seeing hundreds of PLA combat aircraft cross that line on a daily basis sometimes. You have balloons that are crossing the center line that are actually flying over sovereign territory of Taiwan and threatening the people of Taiwan. Over the last 3 years, especially the last 2 years, you've had aircraft carriers operating east of Taiwan that we never saw before, flying hundreds of sorties of fixed wing and helicopter aircraft, and basically being coordinated. We saw in the joint strike exercise in April of 2023, a coordination between the Strategic Rocket Force and the PLA Air Force and the PLA Navy, all working in concert to basically demonstrate how they would take down and invade Taiwan. So, I mean, we're seeing the manifestation of this failed policy, and we saw an administration that said, "Hold on a minute, let's check this. Let's tap the brakes and let's say, why are we doing this? And let's maybe have some constraints here, like economically, as President Trump was one to say, the Chinese are ripping us off." I mean, people chuckled about that, but in terms of economic relationship, the United States was being abused, and so Trump said, "I got to do something. Let's put some tariffs on." We had spying running through the country, so we started a China initiative CIA and in the FBI, initiatives to look out and ferret out Chinese espionage. We actually shut down a consulate in Houston that was a rampant spy nest. Okay, we did some things. We had a declining Navy defense procurement and allocation process. Trump stopped it and was starting to rise it. Okay, all these things. Just yesterday there was a revelation by Reuters that Trump was actually had the CIA conducting a covert influence campaign inside China, which you would expect somebody to do if they think that China is an adversary. So we could go down a list of many, many things that that administration had done. And obviously, from Brad and I's perspective, that was something welcome. And we quote in the book, there's a letter in there that we wrote back in 2018, 2019 called Stay the Course, where we recommend that we should continue on this path of checking and making sure that China can't go after us. Well, unfortunately, what we saw this last year makes us cause and worry that we're returning to the policy of engagement. And we just go down this brief list, but last January of 2023, Secretary Blinken was announcing that he was going to Beijing, and then all of a sudden a spy balloon popped up over the United States that was revealed by a private U.S. citizen, not by the government of its own accord. So he had to delay his visit. But before he went in June, the Biden administration sent CIA Director Burns to China on a covert mission to reestablish engagement. So Burns went in May, Blinken goes in June. A few weeks later, Secretary Treasury Yellen goes, and she physically kowtows to the Chinese Communist Party. Then you have climate czar Kerry went and said, I can work with the Chinese because they're going to help us with climate change.
Mm-hmm.
Then you had Kissinger's last official visit going, and then Secretary of Commerce Raimondo, who just this last week said, yeah, I can see Chinese electric vehicles driving on the streets of America. And now it all culminated last November with the summit between Xi and Biden. So we have a great concern that our message was coming out saying we had to move away from the engagement school, and it looks like it's back in bloom. And they're not going to call it engagement because that word is now, it's cancerous. So they won't say it's engagement. They'll call it intensive diplomacy, or they'll talk about establishing cooperation where we can and things of that nature. They'll use different language, but it's essentially the same thing of engaging and embracing the Chinese Communist Party. And we know the results of that. And so this is our greatest concern, is that we know the lesson. We've studied this history. We've tried to inform the public, but yet we're seemingly having the same people that were in that Obama administration and before that believe fundamentally in their hearts that engagement is a good thing. They're back at it again. And that's really dangerous for the world, and not just America or obviously the people of Taiwan.
I wanted to focus a little bit on the disastrous Obama administration because we have those examples of the Scarborough Shoal, where both Obama and Kurt Campbell failed, and he actually moved up. He's now higher in the ranking. Actually, I checked him before the show, and he's literally described on Wikipedia as an American diplomat and businessman, currently serving as the Deputy Secretary of State. And now I wanted to quote Eric Prince, because I listened to his Sean Ryan podcast, and after he sold Blackwater, he said he was cooperating and doing business with the Chinese. And one of those guys connected to the party, he said they couldn't even dream about retaking and fortifying those islands. But as he says, the Chinese guy told him Obama was so weak, they had to seize the opportunity. So maybe you could tell us a little bit how it really looks from the American perspective, and is there any recognition of their failures, or are they still treated like saints? Because actually the Obama next administration is still in power, the same people, as you just said.
I'll just briefly go over the military aspects, and I'll let Brad talk about the administration. I was the director of intelligence for the U.S. Pacific Fleet in 2012 when the Philippines got word from their fishermen that there were Chinese commercial vessels that had approached Scarborough Shoal, which is a shoal about 140 miles northwest of Manila, inside the Philippines, Republic of the Philippines exclusive economic zone, which they have the rights by the United Nations Convention Law of the Sea for any of the resources that are in those waters. So the Chinese were there essentially sending in smaller boats that were going in and taking out giant clams and coral heads, and then taking them back to these commercial boats that are on the outside of the shoal and loading them in the holds of the boats. And the Filipinos had just acquired a boat from us called they named it the Gregorio del Pilar, but it was an old ex-Hamilton class Coast Guard cutter from the U.S. that we had sold to them. And it was stripped down. It didn't have any munitions or guns or anything like that, but it was still part of the Philippine Navy at that point. And it had been down in the Spratlys doing its resupply run that they had been doing down there for decades. And they were coming back to Manila, and they got this word that the Chinese were at Scarborough Shoal. So the Philippine Navy redirected the Gregorio del Pilar out to the shoal to take a look. And when they got there, they saw what the Chinese were doing, and they went aboard these Chinese vessels, and they videotaped them looking in the holds and seeing all this stolen material from the Philippines. And they, the Philippine Navy guys had, weapons and things of that nature, but they didn't harass anybody or hurt anybody. They just took pictures and video and documented, and then basically said, "You got to get out of here. This is our shoal. You're stealing." And that led to a confrontation where in about 3 or 4 days, the Chinese dispatched over 10, almost 11 ships from their combined forces of what's today called the Chinese Coast Guard. And they surrounded the shoal, and there was a standoff. And throughout that period, from April of 2012 until June, there was negotiations that began between the Philippines, the Chinese, the PRC, and the U.S. And our lead was the Kurt Campbell, who was at that time the Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia and Pacific Affairs. Basically the number one person under the Secretary of State for Asia, and that was Hillary Clinton was the Secretary of State, and Kurt was right under. So he was the lead guy negotiating. And on the Chinese side, you had Madame Fu Ying of the foreign ministry, and then you had the Philippines foreign minister. And what happened is that they crafted up an agreement that said on June 15th, both sides will leave the shoal, and then we'll continue negotiations, but we'll lower the temperature by getting everybody out. No one will be inside the shoal. Well, on June 15th, that day came, and the Filipinos dutifully, followed what they thought was the agreement, and they left. And the Chinese did not leave because they said it didn't apply to certain ships, and so they stayed in. So since June 16th, 2012 until March 15th, 2024, today, the Chinese Communist Party has had physical control over sovereign territory from a U.S. treaty ally. And again, for those who don't know, the Republic of the Philippines is a treaty ally of the United States of America. We have a mutual defense treaty. And the Obama administration was very ambiguous about that at the time, didn't stand up and say clearly and unambiguously that Scarborough Shoal is part of that treaty. And if you, China, take this, then you will have broached the sovereignty of the Philippines, and we have a duty bound to defend them. We were ambiguous about that. In fact, many in the Obama administration didn't want to do that, and they openly said that. So at the end of the day, we let our ally down. The Philippines is not happy. It basically led to, I think, the election of President Duterte. It empowered his election, who was a strong anti-American, and it really disrupted America's credibility in the Indo-Pacific. And it wasn't just the Philippines. Taiwan saw this, the Japanese saw this, the Koreans saw this, Vietnam saw it, Thailand saw it. This had a big impact on Thailand, the Kingdom of Thailand, and eroded our relationships with them. And then obviously Australia. So it was a bad event, but it's one that's never really talked about today in foreign policy circles. You don't see any articles in the prestigious Journal of Foreign Affairs or Foreign Policy. They don't want to talk about this. And as you said, Campbell's been promoted up based on his failure.
And
Yes.
a larger issue with respect to the Obama administration was its weakness, of course, which was well seen, as Jim has mentioned, in terms of in the Indo-Pacific area. But the disaster at Scarborough Shoal in 2012 was also followed by other incidences. For example, the cyber agreement, right? The essentially the news reports, of course, awareness of how ubiquitous Chinese cyber warfare was against the United States in terms of the collection of information. The cyber agreement, of course, in 2015, which was violated. And then in 2016, on obviously the last year of the Obama administration, where the Permanent Court of Arbitration ruled in favor of the Philippines, and yet nothing happened, right? China said, of course, it was not going to accept the ruling. And the Obama administration, having given the opportunity by the PCA to correct its mistake made in 2012, let that pass, right? That the Chinese simply said, we're going to ignore it, and the Philippines had to accept it. So there was the impression, as Jim has alluded, of course, that China was on the march in the area. And the continued expansion in the South China Sea has led to a very dangerous situation. But fundamentally, it weakened America's deterrent posture because allies looked, and partners around the world, not just in the Indo-Pacific, but around the world, looked that there was a feckless. China could do what it wanted in the South China Sea. The quote-unquote pivot to Asia, rebalancing, later pivot to Asia, was feckless. It did not have any tangible impact, with obviously modest naval resources, modest marine resources flowing to the area. It was not what was needed by any stretch of the imagination. So the Obama administration, both terms of it, greatly weakened America's deterrent, conventional as well as nuclear deterrent, upon which our allies and partners depend, and ultimately stability in the region depends. And it was only with the Trump administration that that was able to be reversed. And however imperfectly, it was only with the Trump administration that measures were taken to augment U.S. deterrence with respect to modifications in the U.S. nuclear arsenal, essentially developments in our conventional force posture, and measures, of course, in a more rigorous and forceful diplomacy in the area. But Richard, as you well know, the Obama administration was a disaster, and the willingness for an administration that touted, of course, global norms and principles and international law to allow the PCA, the Permanent Court of Arbitration's decision, to pass, and to allow China to ignore that, was greatly damaging and reverberates to this day.
If you believe in me, please like it, leave a comment and share the show with friends. It might not look like it, but I have quite a lot of expenses. I am not asking for money, only for support. The goal of this program is to spread the knowledge.
Experts like to blame President Duterte, like he was anti-American, but why wouldn't he? I mean, the US, I mean, Obama failed him twice. I mean, why would he still believe the US, right?
Well, indeed, small states that are facing down a great power like China, right, need support from the U.S., and we did not provide it to the Philippines. It was only until, again, the Trump administration that measures were taken to shore that relationship. But that was absolutely needed. Small states facing China need to know, right? Small or medium-sized powers like the Philippines need to know that the United States is going to honor its alliance commitment. And if there's any ambiguity about that, that introduces, of course, a profound complication in their calculus, as those small and medium-sized states think, well, if the U.S. isn't going to back me, should I go neutral, right? Should I bandwagon with China? Is the U.S. finally going to come around? So that is not what is needed. In a clear, unambiguous declaratory policy from the U.S. is the linchpin of stability. Allies need to know and partners need to know what the U.S. commitment is going to be. And sadly, Obama did not provide that. And as Jim has mentioned previously, the Biden administration has conveyed weakness and doubt on that front. So it's still a very dangerous situation.
Yeah, as a follow-up question, I wanted to ask, is there really a consensus in the current administration? Because I mean, Biden surprised me. He seems to be vocally, anti-China, boots on the ground, blah, blah, blah. But as Jim just described, there seems to be a reversal. So is there like two different options or centers in the Biden administration? Because obviously they are harder on China, more pro-Taiwan, but at the same time, those people who have never been like that. So how does it work? Is there really an anti-China faction and one that is more, one that is less pro-China? How does it work?
I think Jim provided the cavalcade of administration officials who visited China in 2023 to restore engagement. It's quite clear that the Biden administration did not immediately abandon Trump policies when it came into office. And clearly there was a debate in the Biden administration about what its approach to China should be. It seems to have settled on they're going to take some measure on the technological side, right, which is often described by Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, as a small yard and high fence, right, where they're going to protect a small number of technologies rigorously. Whether that's practical or not is another issue, but in every other respect, it seems to be that engagement is back in full force, and the Trump administration policies to which they adhered in practice, if not in name, have been abandoned, and they're going essentially towards engagement. They've brought engagement back. That failed engagement policy, as Jim has said, under a new name, right? But nonetheless, any effort to restrict the PRC seems to have been abandoned by the Biden administration. And the actions that it took, particularly in 2023, seems to show that any debate about anti-PRC folks and pro-PRC folks has been resolved in favor of the latter. Pro-PRC engagement school is dominant.
Yeah, you're right. You're absolutely right. Those chips seems just like a distraction because actually nothing much else is happening. Jim, now back to you. What do you think about that?
Well, I think, as Brad described, I think you're seeing the effects of of a harder line, the reversal of the policy of engagement by the Trump administration. It created in the U.S. government. That's another one of these reasons why leadership is so critical, is because it actually turned the ship of state towards saying, okay, we have to combat this threat. And so it created, people were on the engagers all of a sudden started writing articles in Foreign Affairs saying, questioning the engagement school for the first time. So there was this idea that, Kurt Campbell actually and Eli Ratner, who's in the Defense Department today, actually wrote an article in Foreign Affairs questioning the validity of engagement. And it was because there was a new view of this. And so that lingered. And then you started hearing talk about a bipartisan consensus. And so I think what we saw in the Biden administration was the lingering effect of the positive, I call it positive nature of what Trump's administration did, that it lasted for so long into the Biden administration. But as we see now, it's clearly it's clear now where they're headed in the larger sense. Now they'll tout some other things, like there was just today in the news an announcement of a possible trilateral meeting between Japanese Prime Minister Kishida, the Philippines President Marcos, and then President Biden here on the 10th and 11th of April in Washington, D.C. So there's talk about and this occurred during the Obama years. They would always like to talk about our strength is our alliances. And I believe that. And I believe that in my career, and I worked towards that. But in essence, that becomes hollow if there's never any physical follow through. So, like, again, the Scarborough Shoal incident, debilitates the talk of alliances when you don't actually support your alliance members. So you can have these trilateral meetings. You can meet with Pacific Island leaders in Washington, like that Biden has done. But the fact of the matter is, we're having an erosion. This administration is reverting to engagement, and we see it reflected in statements from our allies. For instance, today in China, in Global Times, they quote the Australian Foreign Minister Penny Wong saying that Australia's approach is consistent. We seek to cooperate with China where we can, disagree where we must, and engage in our national interest. That was not what you heard during the Morris administration. So the words are changing from our allies. They're using the same language. We cooperate with China where we can. So we're back to cooperation. They won't say engagement, but it's back to let's talk, let's have parties, let's have state to state dinners, let's open up and let your guys come in and just have free reign in our countries. Let's invite more students in, let's have more espionage. And it's just a reversion to this failed policy. And I think that's one of the deleterious effects of having a leader that doesn't understand the true nature of the threat of the Communist Party. Now, maybe Biden understands it, and we've seen him, and when asked bluntly, would you defend China? He's like, yeah, I'll do it. But at every point that he did that in those four statements, his administration, his handlers walked his words back. So it doesn't inspire confidence, I'm sure, in a lot of people in Taiwan, and it certainly doesn't inspire confidence with Brad or I. So I think this is really the challenge right now is what's going to happen in November, and are we going to get somebody back in office that's going to have a much more realistic appreciation and a power politic view of the threat from the Chinese Communist Party. And I'll just say, you mentioned that, what happened at Scarborough. We talk about the relation, what impact it had on our allies, but you mentioned and you referred to it incentivized China. It incentivized China to move quickly and build those 7 islands in the Spratlys. And then, Xi came to Washington in 2014 and promised Obama, hey, we're not going to militarize them. And yet today, look at what we're seeing. We're seeing Chinese warships, submarines, bombers, fighters, ISR aircraft operating from those islands. So there's a laundry list of things where we were told they wouldn't do something and they do the exact opposite. I mean, at some point you have to ask yourself, are these people really that stupid, or do they have another idea?
I would just add the failure of the Biden administration to stand with the Quad is also notable, where after the G7 at Hiroshima, Biden, as you recall, Richard, was supposed to go to Papua New Guinea, would be the first American president to visit Papua New Guinea, and then to move on to Canberra to have a visit in Australia where he was going to meet with Modi. And you were going to have, in essence, a Quad meeting. And Biden, of course, canceled that, right? So the U.S. president did not go to Papua New Guinea, which would have been a very important symbol given PRC's advance in Solomon Islands, of course, in the South Pacific. And our Grant Newsom, of course, and Cleo Pascal have done incredible work in documenting the penetration of the PRC in those in the Pacific area. But the slap to Modi, right, again, that there does seem to be profound tension between Biden and Modi, where he does not want to take measures with a key partner like India in the Quad, and with whom we have and should develop and deepen security cooperation. So the rhetoric has been about the importance of allies, but in reality, they have insulted or our greatest allies, Australia, key partners like India, and then key states in the region like Papua New Guinea, where individuals were given the day off in the anticipation that Biden was going to visit. It was a major event in Port Moresby, right? It was going to be a holiday and a great celebration. And the fact that he, for whatever reason, whether his frailty, he was unable, was greatly damaging to U.S. diplomacy. And again, that is not remarked, right? That passes without essentially any comment. But it's well remembered in the South Pacific, and it's well remembered on Australia and India as well.
So now, what should the Americans do? What should the current or the next government do? What do you think should the US do to counter this trend?
Well, in the book, we start off by basically, and this is really Brad's area, but I'll just mention it briefly and let him go into it more. But we need to get back to power politics. We need to recognize that we live in a dangerous world, and that the Chinese Communist Party has a strategy to be the global dominant power. And they talk about it. They write about the global governance system and the global defense initiative and the global development initiative and the global security initiative. They have all these global initiatives, the Belt and Road, but it's clear from what they say externally, what they say internally, what they've procured in terms of military, what their actions are diplomatically, what their propaganda says, all of that is they want to be in charge of this new world order. And there's only one country that stands opposed to them, and that's the United States. And so the uh, the uh, the first thing that we need to do as a nation is get back to what we understood in the Cold War, which is that when you face an enemy, you have to prepare as if you're in an existential threat, and as Brad is likely to say or has said many times, the first rule is you don't aid and comfort your enemy. You don't give your enemy the tool to kill you. So we have to stop that. We have to recognize the threat for what it is, and then we need to get on with defending ourselves. And I'll let Brad go a little deeper on that.
Well, to build on what Jim said, of course, recognize that the PRC is an existential threat. It's the enemy of the United States, our allies, and people around the world. And we need to focus our efforts on killing the Chinese Communist Party. Right? That's the intent: is to eliminate their rule and their tyranny over the Chinese people. And recognized that, as Ronald Reagan observed in March of 1983, that the Soviet Union was the center of evil in the modern world. In a very famous address that inspired people around the world, particularly Central Eastern Europe and within the Soviet Union itself, we need to have that clarity, that strategic clarity that the Chinese Communist Party is the center of evil in the modern world. And we are in a fight that's going to determine the dispositive question of the 21st century, which is whether tyranny is going to define the dynamics of the relationship and the parameters of international politics, or whether freedom will, led by the United States, its allies, and people of goodwill around the world. And so we're in that fight, and that question is going to be answered one way or another. All right, the United States can't hide at home. It's going to have to address this issue, as well as our allies and partners and people of goodwill around the world. So it's incumbent upon us, recognizing that, to labor to resolve that favorably. Freedom should define the 21st century, and that requires eliminating the Chinese Communist Party, working with the Chinese people to do so, working with key partners like Taiwan, which has so much, the Chinese diaspora, if you will, worldwide, and then allies and other partners and the American people, to recognize the nature of the odious regime and labor to end its tyranny. And if we do not, all of the center of gravity is the CCP, and it has to be confronted and destroyed, just as the Communist Party of the Soviet Union was. Right, our fight was not with the Russian people. Our fight is not during the Cold War. It was with the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. Likewise, the Chinese people are representatives, of course, and the progeny of an incredible civilization. Right, Han civilization, of course, has contributed so much in philosophy, religion, literature, poetry. Right, it's a great civilization in every respect. It is essentially in a headlock by a Western ideology. Marxism, Leninism, Stalinism, right, was forced on China by Stalin, the Communist International, and Stalin ultimately forced this ideology on China through the Chinese Communist Party and Mao Zedong, right? Obviously, very importantly, we have to end that That's the last legacy of colonial rule in China, right? It wasn't Hong Kong or Macau; it's actually communism, and we have to free it, and so that China can have its own path, its own polity, right? And recognize that Taiwan, of course, is a key exemplar in so many respects, but to free the Chinese people from that tyranny is absolutely essential. And if we do not, then the question might be answered negatively that tyranny defines the 21st century. And this century is a very dark one. We went through the struggles of the 20th century, and those struggles were profound and lasting and costly in every respect for people around the world. Thankfully, the 20th century essentially ended on the note of freedom, but it's not at all clear that the 21st century will be. So progress begins absolutely by recognizing they're the enemy, that they're illegitimate, they're beyond the bounds of international society, and they should not be part of it. And all people around the world should unite in expelling that colonial rule of the Chinese Communist Party from China and assigning it, of course, to the ash heap of history. So these are the focus, the clarity of the enemy, and what needs to be done should govern the U.S., its allies, partners, and again, people of goodwill around the world.
Liking and subscribing is greatly appreciated, and it helps me keep this channel going. My goal is to spread the opinions and experience of the best people in this industry.
I have two questions left. One, I wanted to ask you, you were just now, I think, in Washington promoting the book. So how it's been just on the market for a few weeks, how has been the reception so far? Especially, I mean, by the establishment. Maybe you heard anything from the people you described in the book. It's very strong, right? So how has been the reception?
My take on it is from the people that we've talked to, and we did distribute it to the Capitol Hill to various offices, and the people that we talked to, it seems like for the most part people are in agreement with the thesis because it's based on observable, provable facts. So I don't think there's been a lot of negative press to it. As you said, it's out early. I don't think it's been digested from some of the what I would call the engagement camp yet. We're going to be distributing that book probably today or tomorrow to a group of engagers, a large group of significant engagers are going to get informed about this book in the next 24 hours. So that'll be interesting to see if it's either ignored. I suspect that they'll ignore it, which is what they largely do. They've learned that if they highlight an issue that they disagree with, they'll ignore it. So I think that's where we're at.
Well, the reaction has been very positive to the book thus far. Again, it's new, of course, and so it's still in its infancy, if you will. But the reaction that we've had has been remarkably positive from the stories that have been done on it so far. Bill Gertz had a wonderful, essentially, assessment of it in his Inside the Ring column in the Washington Times on Thursday, March 14th. But of course, and the book has been welcome additionally because, as Jim mentioned, the argument that people are looking to answer this question: how did this happen? And the book goes some way in answering that question fully and helping to start the debate about we need to understand our mistakes so that we can begin to correct them and ensure that we do not repeat them and in the future with future administrations. So thus far, it's been a very positive reaction.
My last question is, we are speaking now in March 24. What should we be looking for in 24, maybe even 25? What do you foresee for the, let's say, next year, especially before the elections in the US?
I'm glad you asked that question, Richard, because I was wanting to make sure that we did not leave this issue of
Yes.
time out there. We are in what I have described, and it's in the book, this decade of concern, where we know that the PLA leadership, Hu Jintao and Xi, had ordered the PLA to have the capability to take Taiwan as early as 2020. And by our recollection, they would probably use military force if they were forced to use it, maybe as late as 2030. That had been the going-in thesis that I had been, discussing when I was in uniform until I retired, and for the last decade, just about telling people that 2020 to 2030 is really the most dangerous time. And as the decade would go along, that there'd be increasing pressures inside the Communist Party to say that, hey, our non-kinetic pressure points are not working, and therefore we're going to have to use the military. And I had always presumed that it would be more towards 2030, maybe even as late as 2035. But what I've seen in the last 3 years has altered my thinking. And so I'm very, very concerned that we're going to see some kind of military action here. It's possibly as late as this year. My personal opinion is that Xi will not take any military action before the November 5th election, because Xi, despite what some people would say, the overwhelming evidence is that Xi would prefer to have a continuation of a Biden or Obama-like administration. They do not want to have a Trump or a Trump-like administration come back. That's clear from everything they are even saying today. They were even in their press today in Global Times bemoaning what Trump had done. So there's no question about that. So I don't think they're going to do anything to give Trump a reason for him to be elected. They're not going to want to contribute that way openly. So I think for now until November, we're safe. But given the fundamental transformation of the status quo between the PRC and Taiwan, which, everybody on the left liked to talk about the status quo and said we have to maintain the status quo. But the fact of the matter is that China, the People's Republic of China, and the Chinese Communist Party transformed the status quo into Beijing's favor. They built 350 ICBM silos here in the last 3 years. They have the largest Navy. They have the largest Air Force in the region. They have the largest strategic rocket force. They're daily operating and surrounding Taiwan. They've shot ballistic missiles at Taiwan in August of 2022 with 11 missiles surrounding Taiwan.
Also at Japan at the
And in
same time.
Japan's EEZ.
Yes.
So they are demonstrating on a daily basis that they're sharpening their sword. So one of the things that we talk about in the book that may be controversial for some in your audience in Taiwan is this issue of what do we do to deter the PRC today? And that question is very delicate because we need a bigger military. We need more resources. We need more ships, submarines, aircraft. Well, those things take decades to acquire if we're lucky. The U.S. Navy for the last 25 years has been dilly-dallying over this 350 ship Navy number, and we're still at 292. So we're not advancing the growth of our Navy as we should. So for people in Taiwan to say, well, we'll just wait for America to build up their Navy, that may be a fool's errand. So one of the things that we recommend in the book is that we need to start to have a dialogue with the government of Taiwan and the people of Taiwan and Japan and South Korea about the introduction of theater or tactical ballistic or nuclear missiles. So we need to be able to say, hey, let's talk about this. Not that we're going to shove it down Taiwan's throat, but that we're going to talk about it, and we're going to make the case that why it would probably be beneficial for Taiwan's national survival to have U.S. nuclear munitions in Taiwan, as they previously did many, many years ago, many decades ago. But to have those there, to be able to tell Xi and the Communist Party, you need to go back to the drawing board and recalculate, because they have not calculated this issue. And so if we can make them go back and recalculate their comprehensive national power strategy of how they would conduct an invasion and have to factor in a potential tactical nuclear retaliation by the U.S., that's something that I think we need to do. And it's very controversial, and we understand that. But we also understand that in the Cold War with the Soviet Union, that kind of depth of thinking and complexity of thinking actually contributed to the downfall of the Soviet Union. And we would like to introduce that to the people of Taiwan to say, hey, this is worth considering, and it's not crazy. It's actually a rational, and there's evidence for why this could help Taiwan survive. Because if not, China may take action in 2025, depending on who's elected in this November.
And to that, I would add that Jim and I have argued, and also in our opinion pieces, our regular opinion pieces, that we need to recognize Taiwan, because recognizing Taiwan is recognizing the strategic realities of the 21st century, the reality of today, right now, not the legacy of the past, but right now. Taiwan is an independent state and it should be recognized as such, and that we need to recognize and put the Communist Party of China on the back foot. And that means recognizing reality, and that means Taiwan is an independent state, and we need to move in that direction. In addition to the B-61s and elements that Jim has talked about, in terms of ensuring that the CCP is not able to assume a status quo. They're not able to assume that they have control over the situation and they understand the trend lines. But to upset that, again, by recognizing reality and recognizing that if the US takes those measures, our allies and partners are going to join with us because they're looking for leadership in this respect, which the Biden administration has not provided. And lastly, I would just say 2024, of course, is an epochal year. We had the elections in Taiwan on January 13th, right? We're going to have elections in Britain, and we're going to have the US presidential election. So if we look within the United States, I think your audience needs to understand that we should anticipate massive election interference by the CCP in favor of Biden. The interference through deep fakes, artificial intelligence, TikTok, there are so many avenues of attack that the CCP will employ, will ensure that this election is going to be unlike any other that we've witnessed in U.S. presidential history. And so it's going to be a challenging year in every respect, and it's going to be a year like no other. I think globally, as well as with respect to U.S. domestic politics. But the upside of that, of course, a positive component is that there are opportunities to greatly improve the U.S. posture in the world and to recognize a U.S. which sees clearly what its strategic objectives are and acts expeditiously and promptly to meet those and to realize the strategic needs of the 21st century.
And also recognition, I guess, would be kind of easier and less controversial than discussing nukes, because what can China actually do when the US like nothing? I think might be an easier solution. I have maybe since I have both of you.
First step.
Sorry, could you say again?
Sorry, it's obviously an essential first step. The problem, or not a problem, but the limitation of that first step is that it doesn't have any direct bearing on the military to military balance of
exactly.
power. So, but it's still in terms of leadership. It as Brad noted, it sends up the flag and it says, "Follow me." And it's not just going to be the United States. Once the United States were to recognize Taiwan, there would be a series of nations, not just in the Asia, but across the world, that would say this. And that would have some profound impact on the Communist Party. And it would send them back to the drawing board, at least their diplomats, to rethink what they're doing.
Okay, since I have you both here, please, one more little question, because this is, Jim, what you mentioned. I wanted to ask about those military aid Chinese, because no one really discusses it. So if you could maybe add a few sentences, both of you. This is something that only actually Michael Yon discusses in the social media. What do you know about that? What do you think about that? That is, I think, very profound.
Well, the military folks that are coming across the
yes.
border.
Yes.
Well, I've been following Michael Yon's reporting for
yes.
the last 2 years, and he's contacted me, and I've seen the videos, and it's very clear that there's been a dramatic spike in this year of 2024 from the PRC. And so we saw a video, I think, last month where there was literally hundreds of Chinese slipping through a crack space in the pre-existing wall in Texas, in one spot in Texas. And they're just coming across. And when you look at them, there's no women, there's no children for the most part, like 99% of them. They're younger males. They're in their 20s. They have the kind of a look of the PLA, which I guess anybody could get a haircut and you could say that, but they all look physically fit. They're not out of shape. They all have brand new clothes, brand new bags. They seem to be sponsored by somebody, and they're coming in. And what we don't know is where they're going. And so Brad and I have written about this. I mean, we have to assume that some of these people are clearly being sent by the PRC on purpose. So that could include people like special operations forces, agitators, people that are specifically designed to go after areas of disruption in our country, whether it's rail networks, road networks, power grids, nuclear power stations, all of that. So, or even our food supply. We've seen a series of explosions and fires across America from food supply. Now, I'm not suggesting that we have any evidence that directly links that today, but we don't know. And so I think there's a great concern amongst many Americans that are, not academic types, but just regular Americans that are watching their nation be transformed by the influx of, 8 to 10 million illegal aliens. And then now finding out that some of those are from China is really something that we have to get our hands around, and we can't just ignore it.
Look, this is muscle. Xi Jinping is sending muscle into the United States for him to act, and that's covert action. These guys are intel agents, they're military, they're going to be the muscle that he needs to interfere in elections. It's going to be the muscle that he needs. You can do certain things on cyber, obviously, through cyber and other media, but there are things you need to actually be physically present. There are biological weapons labs that we've found. We found one
Yes.
in California. Who knows how many there are? Are these men going to distribute it? There are. We don't know. Clearly, they don't wish us well. There's no question about that. They're PLA, they're police, they're intelligence agents, in addition to others. And so this is the muscle that Xi Jinping needs to really have a fifth column in the United States to go after dissidents, right? To reinforce the police stations, but equally and even more alarmingly for Americans, it's not just directed at the Chinese diaspora, it's directed at our infrastructure, it's directed at our elections, it's directed at, these individuals could conduct assassinations. It's directed at really the health and American security, and it's simply outrageous that this is an own goal, right? This did not need to happen if we had kept a border in place, but it has happened, and the consequences of that are going to be profound. Should Xi Jinping decide to exercise this muscle, even if he does not, these are agents in place, right? So they could be stay-behinds. This is a level of national security threat that we have not witnessed before. And its consequences are profound. It needs to be addressed, and sadly, it won't be under the Biden administration.
I think it was Brett Weinstein who was on Joe Rogan's show. He was invited by Michael Yon, and he said, those guys are hostile, they don't talk to anyone, and most of all, they have even their own special camps. And again, nobody talks about that. Good. Thank you very much. It was really a pleasure. Especially, Brett, in your case, it's very early hours where you are. Thank you very much for the time.
Well, thank you, Richard, for the opportunity. It's a pleasure to meet you. Thank you for the opportunity.
Likewise. Thank both of you.
Thanks, Richard. It's great to see you again. Hope everything's well in Taiwan.
I have so many other explosive interviews on this and similar topics. Please check out my channel.